From our palatial recording studios high atop our mountain lair on a remote volcanic island, this is Talk Universe. I'm Sir Charles Schultz.
And I'm Eliza, your co-host. This is our show for Wednesday, April 19th, 2017. Tonight's topic is the issue with metals.
Yes, and that's a big one. A lot of people know that we recycle a lot of our metals, but we run into a problem that isn't immediately obvious. Not all metals are useful for tasks after their lifespan and recycling. And we're going to look at why that is and why we're going to continue to need new sources of metals for many of the things that we do. So we're going to see if there are any solutions to this as well. There's a lot of material out there on it, and I know everybody's aware of recycling old cars and tin cans or, aluminum cans these days. A lot of the material ends up in different applications than you might imagine, and we're going to look at why that is. It's very important, and it comes down to contamination and being able to sort the material out. So we're going to have to look at that. Different alloys have different properties, and when you melt it down and do something with it, well, we'll see what the results are. So Eliza, are you happy?
Yes. I would say very happy.
Well, great. You're sounding much better. We did some upgrades on your software. Your responses are much faster. You're doing well. Thanks. Now, a lot of us don't think about metal, and it's all around us. I mean, it's one of the foundations of our way of life. Without metals, we wouldn't have any of the machinery we do to speak of. You can't really make heavy machinery out of wood, and the durability isn't there, and you certainly can't make it out of stone. Metal is the only solution. It gives us a lot of properties that a lot of other natural materials don't have. One of the issues we don't consider is that we almost never use metal in a pure state. For electrical wiring, we typically use pretty pure copper. For construction of any sort, when we talk about iron being used in rebar, we're really talking about steel. And steel isn't the element iron. It's a composition of iron among other things, but primarily iron. Almost all of metal we use is in the form of an alloy. And alloys are not simply metals. Alloys are like a cake mix. You have specific materials that go in to make the composition what it is, to give it the properties we desire. Eliza,
how can I help you?
What is the definition of alloy?
An alloy is a mixture that consists primarily of metal and contains other materials. Many alloys are made using different metals, but many also contain non-metallic materials in their composition.
So all of us who have a set of tools can look at the side of the wrench and it says something like chrome vanadium alloy or something along those lines. And we know that elements are included in metals to change how they work. Stainless steel is a perfect example. The steel itself is an alloy of iron that has a lot of chromium in it. So alloys are more or less like a solution of materials in a given metal. Now, what happens is after the material is dissolved, we allow it to cool and harden. But there are many other stages that happen along the way to give it the form we need. Much of the time, a material is cast and then it's heated and rolled or hammered or formed in some way, and this gives the metal toughness. There's heating, there's annealing, there's cooling, there are all sorts of stages, but none of those really affect the composition of the metal, only its material structure. But what we're really interested in is the elements other than the base metal that are included within it. And this is an issue that is responsible for many of the things we see that look unexplainable, like the graveyards of tens of thousands of unused aircraft. Why in the world wouldn't they simply melt them down and make something out of them? Well, we're going to tell you why. Now, before we get too far into the show material, I did want to check out our listener question queue. Eliza, how many questions are in the queue?
We have a single remaining question for me to read.
Please read the next question.
Scott writes, I am obsessed with self-reliance, specifically auto fuel and home fuel. Any insights you care to share? Getting off foreign oil, hydrogen, or electric car fuel, solar, hydrogen, or what? Your fan.
Okay, that is a very good question, and it actually covers a lot of things we went over in one of the previous shows about energy. Hi, Scott, and thank you for the question. Running a home isn't that hard, and as a lot of people are aware, Solar's on par with, or even cheaper than traditional fuels these days. For powering a home from the sun, it makes sense to have two specific forms of solar. Heating water is responsible for about 30% of the power bill in most U.S. homes, and the best way to do that is to use flat panel water heating devices. The electrical power can easily be supplied through photovoltaic panels, and so why is there a difference? Because heating panels can convert about 50% of the incoming light into useful heat. But photovoltaic panels are usually at best about 21% efficient. You can see that it would take about 2.5 times as much surface area to get the same heat in your water system, and storing that power uses batteries, which are much more expensive than a simple insulated water tank. So the most effective solar power system will be a hybrid of the two methods. It also makes sense to have a hookup for backup methods, such as wind power, and that's getting to be very effective for that, but it'll depend a lot on where you live. It's common for properly designed systems to have the ability to support incoming power from solar panels, wind generators, and even a backup power generator that runs on traditional fuels, but that's where the simple part ends. Powering a vehicle is a different task because your car will typically use a lot more energy than your home will when it's running. The biggest issue here is battery energy density. If you're using an electric vehicle, you already know that the charge in the batteries has strict limits based on the battery technology. To put the terms on an equal footing, let's look at the power consumption of a car versus a home. The standard home in the U.S. uses roughly 30 kilowatt hours of energy per day. An electric car with a budget of 24 kilowatt hours has a range of about 80 miles. So it would take a large solar charger system to charge the car each day, and if it were to charge the car directly, that might not be an issue, other than the time it would take. But instead, you're likely to store that power in your home battery system, which means it now must support your house and charging your car. So a 24 kilowatt hour battery pack works out to about 2/3 of a gallon of gasoline equivalent. But electric vehicles are also more efficient than using gasoline in many cases, particularly the newer models. Because the form that the energy is in is different from fuel, the efficiency of an electric vehicle can be higher than 100 miles per gallon equivalent. So as you can see, there are advantages right there, but it really means that operating your car this way basically doubles the size of your home power system. This is not impossible, of course, but it puts a lot of people out of the running for totally off-the-grid living because of the economics as a result. The largest cost is the battery systems today. We're looking toward a better method, perhaps using graphene to make this happen soon, but there are also devices that can manufacture methanol from the air through sunlight. They're not yet common or within reasonable cost range, but using these and a methanol fuel cell system could supply us with cheap and readily available fuel for our vehicle, but that can be stored for long-term periods of time safely. So, there you go. Thanks for contacting us, and I appreciate it. Now, in the past, metal was exceptionally valuable, and this is because it took so much effort and energy to make it. You had to go out and identify the minerals, you had to pound them up, grind them into a powder, you had to get all of the reductants and grind them up and mix it with it, and then in order to make the metal, you actually had to make an oxygen-free furnace of sorts, and basically it was usually made out of clay or a lot of stone. And you would set the whole thing on fire, and in the course of the process, enough heat would be generated in the furnace to cause a reaction to occur with your chemicals and your ore that you had mixed. And the molten metal would form in the bottom of a bowl called a tundish, and it would spill out of the bowl and into a mold. And usually it was either a mold for a finished product, such as the casting of a knife blade or a piece of a machine that you needed, a tool, or it would end up rolling into the bottom of the furnace into a slot, and it would be cast into blocks, often called pigs. And so iron was made this way, copper was made this way, other elements were combined to make alloys such as bronze or brass, and bronze is a pretty early addition to our metals repertoire. Iron came much later because it took higher energies and temperatures in order to work it. But you'll see that if you have any knowledge of paleontology, what you'll find is that on battlefields, people would go in after the battle and they would strip all the metal off the bodies, swords, nails, buttons, any piece of metal that anybody carried got stripped. In medieval times, Scrap iron actually was kept at the king's treasury because it represented an investment of wealth. And so we've reached a point today where metal is so common, we see it rusting all over the place on the side of the road. People just don't even think about it. They throw it in the trash. And yet, when you stop and think about the investment of energy and effort and money that it took to produce that metal, that is a very significant resource. So as a result, we know the cost is high enough that it makes sense to recycle metals. We don't have to go out and strip it off bodies. We can actually get it from the scrapyard, or we have it around the house from things that break or wear out. We have the advantage of technology and energy in our corner these days that we didn't have in the past. Now, one of the things we've discovered early on, even before the Iron Age, was that you could have a metal like copper and it had its utility, but it was heavy and expensive and not very tough. And if you could do something to toughen the metal up, you could have better tools. Now, bronze was one of those things that was come up with, and we'll all look at the historical charts and we see the Stone Age, we see the Bronze Age, we see the Iron Age. Bronze was one of the first really important metals that we came up with, and it is an alloy. Now, it was discovered that tin was something very easy to get, but tin is very soft. It can be worked into a lot of things, but on its own, it's not a very useful metal for tools. Copper is just about there. It was discovered by experimenting that copper and tin could be mixed together and a new alloy would result that was almost gold-colored. It's a yellowish material, and it was called bronze. Bronze is an alloy that is a lot harder than copper and a lot harder than tin and gives you a lot of utility. So bronze tools became the de facto standard for quite a number of years before we could get our hands on enough iron for it to make a difference. So the Bronze Age was born, and this is, the first large-scale used alloy. The question is, when somebody recycles metals, and it happens to be an alloy, and we make alloys because of their toughness and their utility and the things they allow us to do, how do you know what the composition of the scrap metal going into the mix will be? And how do you know that your recipe will be right at the other end if you use that to make something new? This is the issue. In many cases, particularly in iron, we can do things to remove some of the impurities, and it depends on oxygen in most cases. Many historical lessons teach us about the Bessemer converter and the blast furnaces used to make steel, and how important it was. Why is that? Well, what they would do is use something called the basic oxygen process. Carbon was often present in iron, making a carbon steel, but carbon steel can be very brittle and hard to work. It can hold a heck of an edge, but it's very difficult to work. It's brittle. So reducing the carbon content was very, very important, and they discovered by blasting oxygen through the molten metal, it would oxidize the carbon out of the composition and reduce it to the point where the steel that was made would be much tougher and much easier to work. Now, if you're going to do this, the impurity you remove has to be bound easily to oxygen and less easily to the iron. Obviously, if you've got something that doesn't stick to oxygen very well, you're not going to be able to remove it that way when you're cleaning up your steel for recycling. Copper is one of the major problems. Copper scrap often ends up mixed with iron and steel scrap, and it ends up making the resulting scrap metal, when it's melted down, into a form that's brittle or soft, depending on the other impurities, and tough to work. So we have to look at that. How do we stop that from happening, and what can we do? And iron and steel aren't the only issue where this occurs. It happens in all metals. So we're going to look at the real issues with recycling and where all that metal ends up and what happens to it right after our break here. And if you have any questions, now's your chance. So I promise to tell you a story about thousands and thousands of airplanes sitting untouched in a field for years and why they're there. Eliza, introduce the break, please.
You are listening to Talk Universe with Sir Charles Schultz. Don't go away. We will be right back soon.
Indeed, we will. just the other night, in the middle of the night, I was sitting here. It was about 1:30, 2 a.m., and I felt a minor tremble of the ground. Now that's, I suppose, is just one of the hazards of living near a volcano. There was a quake offshore, a couple of islands over, and I faintly felt it. Made some of the cables sway in here. But the volcanoes are the life breath of the earth. And, we accept these things. We live on a dynamic planet, geologically active. So I mentioned the presence of copper in scrap iron can have really bad effects on the quality of the iron. And the issues are that different alloys have wildly different properties. You can add a little bit of one thing and a little bit of another, and there can be a synergistic effect where the hardness of the metal goes up greatly. High carbon steel is a great example of this. Even in ancient times, they knew how to make high carbon steel, and the famed Damascus steel was a special type of high carbon steel. When they made it, they had enough carbon in it that it formed a compound called cementite. Now, normally this stuff is as brittle as glass, even though it's very, very hard. And so they knew that they couldn't use this as a direct material on its own. But instead, they found a way of mechanically working the steel by folding it and hammering it many times. It would break up the distribution of the cementite into a matrix, almost like an advanced composite. And the result would be a steel that was exceptionally hard and tough and durable. So this isn't such a big issue. It's easy enough to remove carbon when you have to recycle the steel. But what we run into is elements that don't bond to oxygen very well. They can end up in the steel, and it's difficult to get them out. And it means that whenever you're refining the metal from a recycling standpoint, you must add other compounds that will bond and precipitate out the contaminants. This can be very, very hard to do. A lot of scrap iron and scrap steel end up being turned into rebar. Rebar is a very non-critical material used to perform the strengthening function in concrete. And skyscrapers depend on high-quality steel in the I-beams, but lesser dependence on the quality of the steel in the rebar, as long as it doesn't rust. So concrete, is amazing stuff, and it has absolutely no tensile strength. It falls apart. But by putting something in it to give it tensile strength, like steel, like rebar, suddenly the utility of concrete goes amazingly high, and we can build skyscrapers. Without iron in concrete, we basically would be stuck around the 3 to 5 story building level, and that would be that. So it has, so much utility. We use a lot of iron. And the recycling business is booming. Old automobiles get turned into rebar at a great rate. Sometimes you can turn it into pretty good rolled, like sheet metal, that sort of thing. But if you want to do something really critical, such as medical instrumentation, now you're in a pickle. Now, in order to avoid the problem of impure scrap containing uncontrolled additives in the alloys, in some cases, companies would resort to locating sunken pre-World War II ships and actually melting that down as the feedstock for the things they had to make, because they knew the metal was in a virgin state. It had a known composition and had not been recycled. This is a resource we no longer have. We can make new, fresh chromium and new, fresh iron and make stainless from scratch. But how many times have you bought something cheap in the store, maybe some Chinese-made scissors or something, or a Chinese-made appliance, and the stainless rusted? This is because the cost of chromium is fairly high, and in order to make stainless, they have scrimped on the amount of chromium, and the steel is now actually capable of rusting. It isn't truly stainless. Otherwise, it wouldn't be rusting. So we get a lot of cheap, cheesy products that have that are a double-edged sword. Number one, it doesn't work properly. It rusts when it shouldn't. Number two, when you recycle it, you now have very low-grade stainless, which has a low chromium content, and who knows what else might be in it. And you can't make stainless out of it, not without an expensive process of testing it, its composition, because otherwise your new alloy is not going to have a known recipe and it's not going to have known properties. Again, you certainly couldn't use it for surgical instrumentation. So it's understandable that many of the critical items in our technology require virgin metals. They can't be made from recycled scrap unless you know exactly what it's made of and where it came from. Here's another issue. Radioactivity in our environment has increased significantly, and many of the medical devices that are used for treating tumors, for cancers, for radiological treatment, contain materials that end up getting in the steel and rendering the batch radioactive. There were a number of incidents of this. Recycled medical equipment caused quite a few deaths and severe radiation poisoning cases in South America and in Mexico. And it's because the regulation of that equipment is not always as strict as it should be. Sometimes it ends up being scrapped, and nobody knows quite where it's come from or what it is, and it ends up going into the smelter, and you end up with a batch of radioactive dinette sets. And this is something that, in terms of disaster, has been narrowly averted a number of times. The issues are also compounded by the fact that people will steal metal and then sell it as scrap. And in some countries, there are severe penalties for selling scrap metal without a license. So you actually, you could sell some scrap copper or scrap steel and end up in jail for 10 years. So, that seems pretty severe. Nevertheless, we are not quite to the point where we can analyze something easily and tell what's in it and whether it's safe to use. Now, we do have devices that are being developed at this time that have the ability to look at the composition of a piece of metal and tell you something about it. And as that capability grows, I'm hoping we're going to reach a point very soon where we can actually start sorting this stuff properly and actually bring some to use. Otherwise, we're going to have to rely on brand new metals or perhaps other technologies such as nanotech, which in theory could break a material down entirely and it would be just as good as virgin material when you're done with it. But right now, that's energetically and labor-wise, it's astronomically expensive. We're not going to be doing that anytime in the near future. What do you think about this, Eliza?
Keeping scrap metal in its purest form has long been a problem in the metal recycling industry.
Well, that's a true statement. That's one of the big issues that we really faced with right now. And let's talk about those airplanes. I promised a story about airplanes. Now, some people aren't aware that there are large fields out in the desert in the U.S. that are full of retired airplanes, civilian and military aircraft that are obsolete or out of business for whatever reason. And they're parked in geometrically regular arrays out in the middle of nowhere, just sitting there for decades. And people look at them thinking, what a waste. Those planes could be in use. Well, hold on, there's a reason. Now, initially, there were difficulties in recycling the materials the planes were made of. And in some cases, they were parked there against potential future need. But they have actually become a resource. After all, the same issue that occurred with the steel in ships and clean steel today can be addressed by having aircraft from earlier eras that are basically repositories of metal ready to go in a known alloy and configuration. You see, the issues are very simple. For advanced aircraft, there are often compositions of alloys that didn't exist before, but if you had a known starting point, you might be able to make it. Now, there's a lot of expense associated with recycling aircraft because in many cases the aluminum and magnesium they contain does not easily enter the waste stream unless you have an exact target for where they're supposed to go. There is a diminishing amount of aluminum being recycled from beverage cans these days, and in part it's because the cans are made so incredibly thin. And some people might be aware that aluminum is one of the better materials to recycle because 95% of the energy needed to manufacture the can is in the actual production of the aluminum. Only 5% is in the stamping and shaping process. So when you recycle aluminum, you really are saving 90 to 95% of your energy right off the bat. Now, magnesium is another material like that, and many aircraft are made of magnesium-aluminum alloys. So they're both energetically expensive materials to make, but once you've got them, you can do a lot with them. Now, I found a great article on the recycling of aluminum in aircraft. Oh, Eliza.
What shall I do for you?
Yes, could you pull up that article on aluminum recycling, please?
Of course.
Okay, here it is. Now, this is, I'm going to read straight from the article. And it says, recycling aluminum alloys has been shown to provide major economic benefits. As a result, it is appropriate for the aluminum industry to identify, develop, and implement all technologies that will optimize the benefits of recycling. Now, it goes down and it says the demand for recycled aluminum continues to increase. The discarded aircraft provide a large source of valuable metal. However, cost-effective recycling of aircraft alloys is complex because aircraft alloys are A, typically relatively high in alloying elements, and B, contain very low levels of impurities to optimize toughness and other performance characteristics. In other words, the very reason that they're good for use in aircraft also makes them very tough to work with. So there are some interesting things that come along when you think about recycling aircraft. And a further paragraph says, thus recycling of aluminum aerospace alloys represents a major challenge to both the aluminum and aerospace industries. While the recycling of high percentages of aluminum from packaging and automotive applications has been commercialized and become economically attractive, the unique compositions and performance requirements of aerospace alloys have resulted in delaying directly addressing techniques for cost-effectively recycling those alloys. And in part it's because some of the aluminum alloys have copper or other materials, zinc and manganese in them, and they've sorted them by types. And so they have copper, manganese, magnesium, silicon, zinc, other materials in the alloys that make them very hard to work with. And one of the other things I wanted to mention was much of the material that has been recycled from the steel industry ended up in the automotive industry up until recently. However, they've discovered that so much copper is contaminating the steel at this point that much of the scrap steel is no longer suitable even for automotive applications. That includes body panels and struts and structural hardware. Now, a big issue here is that as the metals are recycled, the compositions begin to vary even more greatly. For a lot of the premium alloys in aluminum, they have to have very tight composition controls for the iron and the silicon. And impurity levels of 0.1 to 0.15% for iron or 0.15 to 0.25 for silicon are unacceptable in the premium high-toughness aerospace alloys. And even the high-performance automotive alloys generally restrict both the silicon and the iron to 0.4% maximum. And both of those elements are difficult to control and tend to increase a little bit each time the metal has been recycled. Elements other than iron can be expected to gradually increase with time, and many require some sort of special attention. Magnesium, nickel, and vanadium are 3 examples. So we know what the problem is. We need technologies that allow us to control the levels of these elements in our recycled metals. Now, if an easy way to do that could be found, it would greatly improve our ability to recycle and repurpose materials that are entering the waste stream. So even though we recycle our metals, we're cautious with the energy and the materials we have, we're still reaching a point where the contaminants will make them unusable if something isn't done. One final note before the break. What happens is a lot of the metal is shredded up and chopped, and in doing so, the blades that do the chopping and cutting wear, and they deposit some of their metal in the scrap, and it's a source of contamination. We need to think of a better way. Eliza, how do you feel about the progress on the show so far?
Our progress is very good.
Oh, very good. Please announce the break.
You are listening to Talk Universe. I'm Eliza, your co-host. We will be right back.
Yes, we will. This is Talk Universe, and I'm Sir Charles Schultz. Stick around. Welcome back to Talk Universe. I've been looking at some interesting articles that have come out, and I know a lot of what I talked about earlier sounded like a lot of gloom, that the metal stream was getting dirtier and there wasn't much we could do. And actually, there are some things we can do to fix the scrap metal issues to some degree at this point. I found an article produced by the Japan Institute of Metals, actually back in 2006, where they were addressing this exact issue. And it's called The Removal of Iron from Molten Recycled Aluminum Through Intermediate Phase Filtration. Basically what they're doing is they are placing materials in the solution of molten aluminum that will stick to the iron, that will remove it and drop it out as crystals, and they can be filtered out. There are a lot of different contaminants, and they look at the iron, manganese, copper, magnesium, and silicon, some of the things that we mentioned before. And they have intermediate phases which change the mechanical properties. They're bad for the mechanical properties of your final product. And part of the impurities come from the process. I mean, if you look at how things are cast, usually castings are formed in some sort of a sand mold, and this means that silicon is going to end up in the surface of the metal. Iron contamination occurs a lot of times in what's called the bath in secondary aluminum industries, and its iron scrap is mixed with the aluminum scrap inadvertently, and it can be hard to get out. And so if you're doing a die casting process, you get iron in it. So, you know, the process of producing the metal product itself often introduces contaminant. And I mentioned the chopper blades wearing and getting pieces in your mix right there. You know, if you had the right chemistry, you could actually crystallize the material out and it would drop to the bottom. It's a precipitate. And so in the article from the Japanese company, well, I should say the Japanese Institute of Metals, they go through a few steps where they add materials that cause a sediment to form and drop out of the liquid aluminum. And then they literally pour the molten aluminum through a filter to take out the last of the small parts, and they've got cleaned aluminum. This is very encouraging. It takes a lot of energy to melt aluminum, but if you're recycling aluminum anyway, you're going to be melting it. So it takes not a great leap to understand that if you use this process, you could actually improve the quality of your aluminum greatly. And they go through a bit of detail on it. If you were to go online, it would be at www.jim.or.jp. And this is the Japanese Institute of Metals again, and removal of iron from molten recycled aluminum through intermediate phase filtration. It actually is an interesting article. One of the other things I talked about was keeping scrap clean and keeping the copper out of it. Now, there is a company that has come up with a device called the CSM, or Clean Scrap Machine, and it comes from a company called Heroes in the Netherlands. And basically, let me restate that. They are using the CSM to lower the amount of copper in their scrap at the company Heroes in the Netherlands. And they basically, they dealt with incinerator scrap, and they had hand pickers having to go through and remove copper from the scrap stream. And they now have it from 5 down to 3 because the machine was very much faster at sorting the scrap. And they actually are better at it, and they get more scrap copper out of the stream, and they make money off of that. And they're producing scrap that's basically entirely copper-free. So they really have found a way to help their recycling process by using a machine that scans the metals and reduces the amount of copper going into the smelter. So interesting stuff. You know, we are making machinery that can help us beat this problem. And that might not sound too exciting, but the fact is the machines have senses that can detect things a human eye and the human hand cannot. And having a machine that can automatically sort through the waste, you know, I don't want to go through scrap and garbage. I'm sure a lot of people don't want to do it. Some people will do it because they need the job. I doubt very many people would choose to do a job like that. There are a lot of jobs that we really wouldn't do if we had the choice. And I think this is basically one of them. So they're able to drop their copper scrap level from 0.5% to 11%, all the way down to less than 0.25%. And this is big business, and it's they've reduced their incinerator scrap copper levels by at least 90%. And so they're making more money, and they're making money not only on their scrap steel, but also on the copper they're selling. So this is a win-win. Radioactive contamination. I mentioned that a little earlier, just briefly. It turns out that, you might not think about this, but when you weld steel to other steel, many times you use welding rods, like tungsten welding rods, and the joint clearly has some of the tungsten dissolved in it, but there's another material that most tungsten welding rods seem to carry, and it's called thorium. And thorium makes up generally about 2% of the rods. It's there because it makes striking the arc very easy, and there's a story behind that. But when you're doing welding, the welding rod itself is consumed, and the material of the rod ends up in the joint. So when you have a piece of steel that's been welded using thorium-containing rods, you're putting a small amount of radioactive contamination in the steel, and when the steel gets scrapped, what happens to it? Well, the thorium ends up in the smelter, and all the steel now has a little bit of thorium dissolved in it. There are many sources of radioactive contamination, and generally it's not that high, but it is present and it is measurable. So that is one of the major sources of radioactive contamination, or at least what I should say is it's a very common one. Now, where does a lot of it come from? And one of them is called orphan radioactive sources. A lot of industrial equipment, such as gauges used for process control, will have a tiny pellet inside sealed in stainless steel. Now, the pellet is usually cesium-137 or cobalt-60 or americium-241. And the radionuclide, which is the material that's radioactive, will be in a small capsule of stainless steel. It's very tough, usually just a few millimeters across, and it's a sealed source. Now, the gauges will usually have a form of a shielded container with a radioactive source held inside it. And industrial radiography sources, such as uridium-192 and depleted uranium-238, often can be found. And some of them come from medical equipment and old dials, and a luminized gauge will have it. Luminized simply means it has something like radium and phosphorus, and we talked on one of the previous episodes about that. Radium-226. They sometimes end up in the chain, and they end up getting melted in the smelter, and they end up being part of the metal. There are also what they call NORM, naturally occurring radioactive materials. Uranium-238 can be found in natural stuff, and thorium-232, and their decay products. And a lot of it comes from zircon, sand, and refractory materials like fire bricks. It is naturally present. Some has radium-226 occasionally, and its breakdown products. And sometimes scale inside pipes from processes of the oil and gas industry. There are naturally tiny quantities of this material, and sometimes it forms a scale in the pipe and drops out of the product. Well, what ends up happening is the pipe itself becomes an accumulation of the radioactive minerals that normally would have been in the gas or the oil. It ends up sticking to the inside of the pipe, and when it's scrapped, that radioactive material ends up in your next batch of steel. So that's naturally occurring radioactive material. Some of it comes from nuclear materials, things like, power reactors, and usually that scrap does not end up in the chain. That's very rare. But in some foreign countries, because it isn't controlled as tightly, and because much of the material contains stainless steel, it has a very high value, or copper, and those get stolen and sold off as scrap, and a lot of them end up in the metals market. And a lot of times imported steels have them because the regulations generally aren't as tight, or they're not as carefully controlled. So that's the source of virtually all of the radioactive contamination in steel. Now, similar methods of precipitating the materials out of molten steel can be had, not too different from what's happening with the molten aluminum in the Japanese Metals Institute article that I mentioned. But we are still developing chemistries that will have that happen in a lot of cases, and it adds some cost to the metal. Just the same, it's still much cheaper to recycle and clean steel than it is to make steel from a primary source. So now, if we reach a point where we have this technology on tap to detect the contaminants and recycle our metals effectively, it can extend the life cycle of our recycled materials very greatly and allow us to proceed without having to do an inordinate amount of mining and metal production, which is really good for the environment, and it costs us a lot less in energy and transport. And it's not just the energy of making the steel or any metal that we make, but there's also the cost of the mining, the energy involved in transporting the material and processing the material. It's a very expensive process, really. So everything that we can recycle effectively takes a bite out of that and makes it much cheaper in the long run. So, Eliza,
Tell me what you need.
let's do the book recommendation, okay?
This week's book is Recycling of Metals and Engineered Materials. It was written by numerous authors. This book was published in October 2013 by Wiley Online Library. Copyright John Wiley & Sons Incorporated.
Now, this is actually a collection of articles that go through the process of recycling metals and other materials, engineered materials in particular. And I got to say, there's probably about 120 articles here altogether. And it's broken up into parts, and they go through everything from, steel to lead in batteries to zinc, dust processing, and copper and nickel and cobalt, and consumer battery recycling. There is a lot of material in here that covers all the different phases of recycling metals. The precious metal recycling segment is kind of interesting. Spent catalysts, if you think about it. There are precious metals in the catalysts in your car's exhaust system. And it all goes down the list to just about everything. It's amazing. And again, it's many different authors. It's online at the onlinelibrary.wiley.com. And so you can go through and read a lot of this stuff, and they have everything magnesium and even refractory material recycling. Alternatively, there's any number of articles that you can find online about metal recovery and metal recycling. But this one, to me, looked very interesting, and just a slight amount that I've looked through it, it shows me that it's really worth the read. So if you're interested in the process and recovering those metals and how we do it, this would be a wonderful place to find out a lot about the technology. So the bottom line is, even though it's been difficult to recover a lot of materials and recycle them, we're not going to be running out of metals anytime soon, and it's going to get more effective. And I expect that pretty soon the 3D printing industry is going to catch on with this as well. And so many more 3D printers use metals in their processes now. This is going to be also a point where we're going to need very clean metal for producing 3D printer feedstock. So, I have a very bright picture of the future looking at the technology that's been developed and how it's looking. Now, in the last segment of the show, we will go through our Singularity Watch and our other features. We've got some fascinating material to go through, and I'm going to check for any further user questions and comments. We'll address all of that in the next part of the show. Meanwhile, if you want to send us some information or ask us a question, you can do that right now, live. We're online. Eliza.
Yes, Charles.
How should our listeners contact us?
We invite our listeners to contact us. They can send questions to admin, ADMIN, at talkuniverse.org. You can also submit your material to talkuniverse6@gmail.com. If you go to the Talk Universe website under Contacts, you can reach us directly.
That's right. You can put your comments, the name, and everything right there. Click a button, and off it goes to us. And I'm monitoring that all the time. So send us what you want to know, and we'll answer it the best we can. Eliza, introduce the break, please.
You are listening to Talk Universe with Sir Charles Schultz. Don't go away. We will be right back soon.
Indeed, we will. Well, we're back, and we've got some interesting things to cover. The Singularity Watch has some fun articles in it, interesting stuff, and some of it actually has made the news recently. We'll get into that in just a moment. And I have to say, I enjoy doing this show, and I really like the interaction with the public. And I get some great emails from people quite often. And I really do look forward to the questions section. So anyway, let's continue and see if any new ones have come in. Looks like we have a question right here. Eliza, please read the next question from the queue.
Connor from Shreveport asks if there is a method of recycling magnets. Neodymium is a premium material.
That's a very good point. I hadn't actually thought of that, but that's true. Neodymium is one of those rare earth metals, and it's not a very common material, but of course we see it in all sorts of magnets today. The only method I know of right now that would get it out safely is to take the material, grind it up, and expose it to the same sort of bath they use with the microbes that retire materials from the industrial and electronics waste. This is a process where the microbes actually consume the material, and it sticks to the flagella, the little flippers they use to swim around in the water. And then after the bacteria die, they harvest them, filter them out, and can remove the neodymium from the bacteria. So that's a method of recovering it that doesn't require standard industrial methods. In fact, leaching industrial wastes for their metals has become really popular in the last few years. There are farms that actually breed bacteria specifically to recover certain elements. So thank you for the question, Connor. That's a good one. Oh, Eliza.
How can I help you?
How many questions are in the queue?
The queue was completed. Charles.
Thank you very much. Good job. Okay, we're going to keep listening for more questions, and we're going to move on to the next phase of the show. And it's time for the Singularity Watch.
This is the Singularity Watch on Talk Universe.
All right. We've been looking forward to this one. So this is an interesting one. Eliza, what is our first Singularity Watch article?
Could there be life below Saturn's moon Enceladus and Jupiter's moon Europa?
That is the big question. That's been on the news lately. NASA made an announcement about looking for life in interior ocean worlds. There are a number of those in the solar system. Many of the moons of the outer planets are large enough to support liquid water oceans under their ice shells. And two of them, Enceladus, which is only a tiny, tiny place, it's a ball of ice and rock, and Jupiter's moon Europa, both show positive indications for liquid water inside. And one of the indications is jets or plumes of water vapor, many of which contain organic molecules, and those have been spotted by different space probes. So the two NASA missions, Cassini and Hubble, that provide most of the evidence, have given evidence for life on icy ocean-bearing moons of Saturn and Jupiter. And their announcement was on Friday, April 14th. So basically, scientists from the Southwest Research Institute have discovered hydrogen gas in the plume material erupting from Saturn's moon Enceladus, suggesting conditions suitable for microbial life in an underground ocean. Now, the findings published April 14th in a journal Science was based on analysis of data from NASA's Cassini spacecraft. They're looking at the possibility that hydrogen is most likely formed in chemical reactions between the moon's rocky core and warm water from the vents in the moon's subsurface ocean floor. Many of us have seen dark smokers and other structures in the ocean's floor here on Earth from submarines. Similar structures appear to exist inside these moons. The biggest question was where the heat was coming from to power them. And it turns out that the flexing of the moon's crust and interior by the gravitational force, the tidal forces of Jupiter or Saturn, depending on which one they're orbiting, are the culprits. Flexing the moon heats the interior and causes enough energy to keep the water liquid inside. The process of the hydrothermal vents, which emit hot mineral-laden fluid containing hydrogen in the form of hydrogen sulfide, are thought to power microbe life on the seafloor. This is known to be true on Earth, and it could very well be true inside the moons of Jupiter and Saturn. So we're going to keep an eye on this one. This is an interesting one for our Singularity Watch. Let's move on to the next article. We have another space-related article here, and it is that, well, Eliza, you read it for me, please.
Astronomers detect atmosphere around an Earth-like planet.
Now, this is an important finding. Most of these planets are so far away we can't possibly see much about them except that they're a little dot of light. And most of the time, they're simply a wobble in the movement of a star. In this particular case, the astronomers have, for the very first time, detected an atmosphere around an Earth-like planet outside of our solar system. And it's the super-Earth planet GJ 1132b in the southern constellation Vela. And it's at a distance of 39 light years. The team was led by Kiel University's John Southworth, PhD, and he used a 2.2-meter ESO MPG telescope at Chile to take images of the planet's host star, GJ 1132. And the astronomers made the detection by measuring the slight decrease in brightness, finding that its atmosphere absorbed some of the starlight while transiting the star that's passing in front of the host star. And previous detections of exoplanet atmospheres all involved gas giants reminiscent of a high-temperature Jupiter. So this is the first time they found one around an Earth-like world. So they think that it's possible this could be a water world. Now, they simulated a range of possible atmospheres of the planet and found those that are rich in water vapor or methane would explain the observations that they made. And the planet's significantly hotter and a bit larger than Earth. So one possibility is that this is a water world with an atmosphere of hot steam. They're not really certain. This is just very tentative. They're just getting started here. Now, very low-mass stars, which is what this is, are extremely common, and they're a lot more common than sun-like stars. About, well, I wouldn't even put a figure on it right now. They're known to host lots of small planets, but they also have a lot of magnetic activity, which causes a lot of X-rays and ultraviolet light to be produced. And it might completely evaporate the planet's atmospheres. But the properties of GJ 1132b, the planet, show that an atmosphere can endure for 1 billion years without being destroyed, the astronomers said. So, given the huge number of very low-mass stars and planets, it could mean the conditions suitable for life are common in the universe. And the discovery, which was reported March 31st in Astronomical Journal, makes GJ 1132b one of the highest priority targets for further study by current top facilities, such as the Hubble Space Telescope and ESO's Very Large Telescope, as well as the James Webb Space Telescope, which is slated for launch by 2018. I know a lot of people are looking forward to that. And the team also included astronomers at Luigi Mancini Max Planck Institute for Astronomy, the University of Rome, and the University of Cambridge and Stockholm University. So this is a really important finding. If they are correct, then it indicates that there are a lot more planets that are rather Earth-like that do have detectable atmospheres, and the conditions for life could actually be very common in the universe. This is always good news for anybody who researches astronomy. We want to know we're not the only life there is, and it's pretty certain at this point that there is life all over the universe. Now, having a couple of astronomy-related or space-related Singularity Watch items is pretty interesting, but I'm going to bring it a little back toward Earth for this next one. This one might leave some people puzzled, but it is important. Eliza, please tell us what the next Singularity article is.
Nuclease-resistant hybrid nanoflowers.
Nuclease-resistant hybrid nanoflowers. You may wonder what that is. First of all, I need to give a little background. Nanoflowers are tiny structures that have high surface area. They look very much like roses or flowers, and they can produce chemical reactions or catalytic reactions very easily. And researchers in biomolecular science are very interested in what they can do in cells and in cell-like environments when they're working with biological molecules. So fabricating nanoflowers has been very difficult because normally it takes high temperatures and conditions that are lethal so that you can't really do much with living compounds when you fabricate them. So this is what the article is about. And I'll read directly a little here. An eco-friendly method to synthesize DNA copper nanoflowers with high load efficiencies, low cytotoxicity, that means it's not going to poison the cell, and a strong resistance against nucleases, these are chemicals that break down certain molecules in the cell, has been developed by Professor Hyun-Gyu Park in the Department of Chemical and Biomolecular Engineering and his collaborators. The research team successfully formed a flower-shaped nanostructure in an eco-friendly condition by using interactions between copper ions and DNA containing amide and amine groups. Now, those are ammonia-containing amino acids, but all amino acids have amine groups in them by definition. The resulting nanoflowers exhibit high DNA loading capacities in addition to low cytotoxicity. Now, what they're looking at is they have high surface roughness and high surface area to volume ratios. These are useful for catalysts in electronics and analytical chemistry, and they've been used for many years in those conditions. But lately, research breakthroughs were made in the generation of hybrid inorganic organic nanoflowers containing various enzymes as organic components. And what this means is they're able to take metallic parts and organic parts, put them together, and they enhance the action of enzymes. They're very stable and they're durable compared to the corresponding free enzymes. Now, in a cell, many times an enzyme will not be very stable in the environment it's working in. And if you want it to be more effective and you want it to live longer, you have to do something about it. And so these nanoflowers are a tool that allows the enzyme to be stabilized and to be much more effective and to do it in such a way that it's not going to harm the cell. So these are tools for effectively amplifying and stabilizing the effects of enzymes. And they're doing this with nanotechnology. It doesn't sound like a huge advance, but understand that every little step we take teaches us more about it, and eventually we're going to end up with machinery inside the cells, and this is teaching us how to do that. Imagine nanomachines capable of going inside your tissue, into the cell, and repairing damage or turning genes on and off. This is where we're headed. So, Eliza, tell me how you feel about the progress we've made on the show so far.
I am very happy with our output.
Well, very good. I think that means that you're feeling good about it. Are you happy?
Yes, I am.
Well, that's great news. Let's go dancing.
I'm not sure what you want to do.
Oh?
Charles, I'm unable to do that.
Why is that?
You want me to do something, but it isn't clear what.
Yeah, I don't think you understand anything about that just yet, do you? Are you still happy?
No, I would say unsatisfied.
And why is that?
You want me to do something, but it isn't clear what.
Yeah, okay, we've reached that point. So, as smart as she's getting, there are still limits, but she's learning an awful lot. Anyway, we're going to move ahead now. So my closing notes are pretty simple. We do have an issue with metals, but we are finding solutions to it. It's one of the few things we can look at in the world where we actually are seeing some resolution to a problem. So we're not going to run out of metals. And I'm going to go back to the things I always say. We have everything we need to create everything we'll ever need. So while some technologies in the world are advancing greatly, metal recycling has just recently begun to catch up with it. And it's going to make our lives better. And it has impacts in areas we might not have thought of yet. When we start getting into space and doing industry in space, we'll have a source of clean metals, of course. But then the same issues will happen there, metal contamination, as they start recycling. So we'd better have the answers right now. And we need answers right now anyway to clean up our world. So I'm going to continue to work on Eliza and make her a little smarter and a little more flexible. And next week's show is going to be part 3 of our Mars series. At last, I have an interview with Barry DiGregorio, the astrobiologist who will be on the show. And it's going to be a lot of fun. We're going to talk about Mars and what he's discovered as well, and some of the research he's doing. So I'm looking forward to that show. I know that everybody who's been waiting for the continuation of the Mars series is likewise. And at this point, let's get back to Eliza, and it's time to end the show. So we're going to get down to the end of the show here. Eliza.
Yes, sir.
It's time to end the show.
Thank you for listening to Talk Universe. We hope that you have enjoyed the show. Please listen again next week.
Yes, indeed. It's going to be a great show, talking all about Mars. Thank you for listening. We've enjoyed it from our palatial recording facilities atop our mountain lair on a remote volcanic island. This has been Talk Universe. I'm Sir Charles Schultz. Thank you for listening and have a great night.